Immigrants renew America. President Obama says the U.S. must remain a welcoming nation. Critical of Trump, House Speaker Paul Ryan knocks his plan to ban Muslims from entering the U.S., and we have the Vatican's take. World message of peace. Pope Francis urges us to overcome indifference toward the most vulnerable. And Bethlehem Parade. The town where Jesus was born stages its first ever Christmas parade. Those stories and more on EWTN News Nightly for Tuesday, December 15th, 2015. Good evening from Washington. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Brian Patrick with your news now. Republican presidential candidates take to the stage for 2015's final debate tonight. Donald Trump may be the front runner, but he's likely in for a fight with Ted Cruz. Going into tonight's Republican debate, Donald Trump has a huge lead, at least in one national poll. He has crossed the 40% mark in a poll from Monmouth University. That's more than the next three competitors combined. The polling began last Thursday, days after Trump announced his plan to temporarily ban Muslims from entering the U.S. It's a move that's drawing backlash, but it just seems to strengthen Trump's support. A poll from ABC News suggests nearly 60% of Republicans backed the proposal. That's no surprise to the billionaire businessman.
I have many friends that are Muslims, and I will tell you, they are so happy that I did this.
Coming up fast on Trump is Texas Senator Ted Cruz. A pair of polls shows him leading Trump among Iowa Republicans. One of Cruz's biggest backers says polls are fine, but the real test will be at the convention.
I would say that they're not close to being the early voters, the primary voters, and the Iowa caucus goers. So what matters in this is it's about the nomination.
If Cruz does get the nomination, some critics say he's too conservative to win the general election.
He is someone who believes to the core of his being that Republicans fail when they move to the center.
Meanwhile, the rest of the contenders will use tonight's debate stage to try to win back lost momentum. The candidates will likely focus on Trump's proposal to ban Muslims from entering the U.S. Today, House Speaker Paul Ryan explained his criticism of that plan as Jason Calvi reports from Capitol Hill.
Brian, Speaker Paul Ryan says his rule is not to comment on the presidential candidates. So why did he publicly criticize Trump's Muslim ban? I was with him this morning as he answered that question.
I believe in religious freedom. I think most of us do. I mean, it's the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights. Religious freedom, pluralism, this is who we are. This is why this country was founded in the first place. So I just think that when you see your principles, such founding, unifying principles in this country under assault, you have an obligation to stand up for those principles.
But Speaker Ryan has previously promised to support the party's nominee for president, whoever he or she is. And right now, Trump is surging. In a brand new Washington Post ABC News poll, Trump is at a high of 38% support among Republicans. And today, a Vatican official was asked about Trump's proposal. He shared the church's position.
Nobody would leave his home and become a migrant if he could live in peace at home. And when that happens, then we need to see what is causing them to move and try to help bring peace and security in the area so they can stay.
Some conservatives had proposed clamping down on Syrian refugees entering the country. They hope to include that language in the must-pass budget. We are expecting to see the final budget tonight, with a House vote expected Thursday. Brian?
Thank you, Jason Calvi at the Capitol. Tim Carney is senior political columnist for the Washington Examiner. Elaine Kamark, the senior fellow in the Governance Studies program at Brookings Institution. Tim, how do you expect Trump's opponents to handle him tonight, or will he get all the attention again?
Well, Trump is going to go on the attack against Ted Cruz. He always goes after who's ever right behind him. It used to be Jeb Bush. It had been Ben Carson. The thing is, Cruz doesn't want to punch back. He's like a boxer who wants to hug the guy trying to punch him. And so how will that play on stage? For me, that's one of the most interesting questions, is what happens when Trump throws a punch and Cruz doesn't throw one back.
Could be really interesting if he hugs Trump. Do you expect any substantive debate, especially when it comes to national security because of the terror attacks, maybe immigration, Elaine?
I suspect that the candidates who are trying to get themselves heard, particularly the ones with governmental experience, are going to try and be quite substantive, because what we've seen already is the absence of substance really did in one of the front-running candidates, Ben Carson. And so if they can do that to Trump, or then I think that they're going to be really interested in having that kind of debate tonight. So I suspect we'll see a lot of substance.
Some people say that some of the bottom folks are going to drop out after this. If that happens, what does that do to the current leaders as those who have at least pockets of support let go?
Well, you look at a guy like Rand Paul. Tonight, I think you see him making more of a message statement than trying to win voters away. He's decided to become a message candidate. I wouldn't be surprised if he drops out shortly. The little bit of support he has, that naturally, I think, goes to Ted Cruz. And it's similar with some of the Ben Carson support. That's anti-establishment support. I see Cruz gaining from that. There's sort of an establishment team, which is Rubio, Jeb Bush, and Christie. The problem for those three is I don't see any of those three dropping out anytime in the near future, so they'll be dividing up that vote.
Well, all we have so far are these debates, polls, but soon we're going to have caucuses and primaries. You wrote a new book called Primary Politics. What factors do you explore when it comes to picking the nominee to run in 2016?
Well, right now we're in the preseason. Okay,
Yeah.
so nobody has actually cast a vote. One of the things that's going to be very important is the Iowa caucuses, and then 8 days later the New Hampshire primary are the first time voters will actually vote. And so what we don't know is whether these polls are accurate, whether the people saying yes, they love Donald Trump in the polls will actually go to vote in the Iowa caucuses. And the second thing that the book does is the book explains the importance of momentum. There's just nothing like winning those first two contests to get you through the rest of the race. And that is the key to understanding a presidential primary race.
Primary Politics is Elaine's book. Thank you, Elaine Kmark. And Tim Carney from the Washington Examiner. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other stories our EWTN News Nightly team is covering in today's world. President Obama continues selling his strategy to degrade and destroy ISIS. Today, he attended a Washington ceremony for 31 immigrants being sworn in as American citizens. More from our chief White House correspondent and political director, Lauren Ashburn. Lauren?
Brian, in addition to congratulating all of the new U.S. citizens, President Obama said that we have to welcome them. We are a welcoming nation. And he said that we cannot discriminate against immigrants as we have in the past with Jewish, Irish, and Japanese.
Thank you. Please have a seat. Thank you. Well, good morning, everybody.
The president also quoted scripture saying the Bible tells us we are strangers before you, as were our fathers. He cited then Senator John F. Kennedy, who had to convince voters that he wasn't first loyal to the Pope, in reference to skepticism he faced being the first Catholic who could have gone to the White House. And he cited the story of an Iraqi taking the oath today who suffered death threats for defending Americans abroad.
The biggest irony, of course, is that those who betrayed these values were themselves the children of immigrants. How quickly we forget. One generation passes, two generations passes, and suddenly we don't remember where we came from. And we suggest that somehow there is us and there is them, not remembering we used to be them.
And I do think we need to continue to look at tightening up the various ways in which people can come into the country.
And that is one way in which both the White House and Republicans agree on this matter. They think that the law should be scrubbed, including K-1 visas.
Lauren, what did you hear in the president's tone at today's ceremony?
We saw a very passionate president today, Brian, one who spoke about a nation that cannot tolerate bigotry or hatred.
Lauren Ashburn at the White House. Thank you, Lauren. Los Angeles defends its decision to close the nation's second largest public school system today. The LA police chief says the school district safeguards 750,000 people every day. He calls it irresponsible to second-guess its decision. The school district received an email threatening an attack with assault rifles.
based on past circumstances, I could not take the chance.
And an abundance of caution is something that I think all of us who have children appreciate.
New York City received a similar threat, but officials there decided it was not credible. Ohio's Attorney General Mike DeWine wants to make sure Planned Parenthood stops discarding aborted babies in landfills. DeWine planned to file an injunction in state court yesterday, but a federal lawsuit filed by Planned Parenthood complicates his plan. That suit accuses Ohio's health director of changing the interpretation of state law at the center of this debate. DeWine says his investigation has already prompted Planned Parenthood to hire a new vendor. Now he says Planned Parenthood should ensure that the disposal methods used by the new vendor are indeed humane. A Baltimore judge tells jurors to keep deliberating after deadlocking today. That jury is deciding the fate of William Porter, one of 6 police officers charged in the April death of Freddie Gray. Gray's fatal injury in the back of a police van sparked protests and riots in Baltimore this past spring. Investigators in Paris report 3 new terror arrests. A 29-year-old man is under arrest in connection with last month's attacks that killed 130 people. 2 others are accused of providing guns to the man who attacked a kosher supermarket in January. Overcome indifference and win peace. That is the title of the Holy Father's message for the World Day of Peace, January 1st, 2016. Francis's message released today urges policymakers and us as individuals to overcome what he calls the globalization of indifference. He wants us to show compassion for the plight of the poor, the sick, migrants, prisoners, and the elderly. Ed Penton, Rome correspondent for the National Catholic Register, joining us now. Pope Francis urging all of us to overcome this idea of globalization of indifference. What is he referring to in his annual peace message released today?
Right. Well, this has been another sort of leitmotif of his pontificate, Brian, this sort of globalization of indifference. He's used it the last couple of years, and it really relates to this sense of really not of the world, first of all, being indifferent to God, first of all, and that leads to all kinds of indifferences. And he really classes them in 3. First of all, the indifference to God, then the indifference to neighbor, and then he talks about the indifference to the environment. And these are the 3 sort of key ones that he talks about. But he also says that, you know, that you need to get to eternity. It's important that one is not indifferent to the least of all people. So that's the homeless, the poor, the hungry, the estranged, and the homeless. And so all of those groups he talks about as well. So it's very much a sort of, it lays out very much what he means by globalization of indifference in this document.
Certainly those imprisoned are among the most forgotten. What specific actions does he seek for those imprisoned?
Right, well, he talks about he's sort of inviting governments to have a holy year of amnesty, a year of amnesty for prisoners, and to basically find other ways alternatives to incarceration, so sort of find ways to rehabilitate them or find ways really to extend the hand of mercy to them in a different way. He's always been very strong on helping prisoners and finding ways to reach out to them. I mean, he goes every year, as viewers will know, on Holy Thursday. He washes the feet of prisoners. He always visits prisons when he goes abroad to different countries. And in fact, he's going to visit one in Mexico when he goes in February. So this is very much central to his pontificate, is helping prisoners. And of course, that's very much in line with the gospel and Jesus' call to reach out to those who are imprisoned and minister to them.
And he is specifically asking for the abolishment of the death penalty in this message of peace. Ed Penton joining us from Rome. Ed, thank you so much.
Thanks, Brian.
Conservative Latinos are paying close attention to tonight's Republican presidential debate. Their objections to Donald Trump's immigration stance casts a shadow on some of the other candidates as well. Alfonso Aguilar, executive director of the Latino Partnership for Conservative Principles, criticizes Texas Senator Ted Cruz. He expresses concern that Cruz has gone out of his way to publicly embrace Donald Trump and even applaud him after Trump made insulting comments regarding the immigrant community. Alfonso Aguilar Skyping with us from Las Vegas. Alfonso, what is it that you and your group would like to hear from the Republican candidates tonight?
Well, in terms of immigration, we want them to be constructive on the issue. We want them to show that they're committed to the rule of law and to protecting the security of the border and enforcing immigration laws, but at the same time, we want them to show that they're looking for a way to bring people out of the shadows. It doesn't mean that we have to follow what President Obama has proposed, but it means that conservatives can propose something that is uniquely conservative, that is consistent with the rule of law, but at the same time it's compassionate and recognizes that we cannot deport 11 million people, that we need to bring people out of the shadows. Obviously, we're having a problem with Mr. Trump and even with Senator Cruz. But I think in general terms, the majority of the candidates want to be constructive on immigration.
Is immigration the main reason Latino voters tend to align with Democrats? What about the other moral issues such as life and marriage?
Well, ironically, they don't align with the Democrats so much as they vote for them. And there's a difference. Poll after poll shows that they identify as independent. They end up voting for the Democrats because they feel that Republicans are antagonizing them, don't care about them, and it is because of immigration. It's a gateway issue. They're certainly pro-life, the majority. They believe in marriage and religious freedom, so Republicans can win their vote. The problem is that immigration is such an identity issue. It's a gateway issue that if you're not able to overcome that issue, they're not going to listen to you on those other very important issues that we deeply care about.
Does the Republican nominee need the support of the Latino voting bloc to be elected president?
No doubt in my mind, a candidate who cannot get over 40% of the Latino vote. If you look at the battleground states like Florida, Nevada, where we're at, Colorado, even Virginia, the Latino vote is decisive. So if they cannot do better with Latino voters, they're not going to win the White House. That's why they have to be constructive on immigration.
Alfonso Aguilar, thanks for Skyping with us from Las Vegas tonight. We appreciate you.
Thanks for having me.
Coming up, Saudi Arabia leads an effort to form a Muslim military coalition against terrorism. And preparations are underway along the U.S.-Mexico border for an open-air papal mass. Thanks for joining us this Tuesday evening. I'm Brian Patrick. And Saudi Arabia says 34 nations have agreed to form a new Islamic military alliance. The goal is to fight terrorism and root out extremism. Wyatt Goolsby is here with more tonight.
Brian, the coalition is made up of mostly Muslim-majority countries from the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. What's not clear is how exactly these countries will coordinate their military forces. Saudi Arabia's foreign minister announced the coalition in Paris today. The Saudi Arabian government says terrorism is a violation of human dignity and rights, especially the right to life and security. Most Gulf Arab countries like Kuwait and Qatar are in the group. Iran and Iraq are not part of the group. But counterterrorism expert Sebastian Gorka tells me he's not convinced.
Saudi Arabia leading a coalition? When have we ever seen the Arab nations lead a coalition that effectively fought another nation? Even against tiny Israel, they were completely inadequate to the task. And as a result, we are, again, the missing piece of the pie. Unless America is part of that coalition, unless it drives that coalition, then this is just a public relations stunt, really.
Saudi Arabia is officially a U.S. ally, but Gorka says there are factions in the country that support Islamic extremism. The White House says the coalition will not be a substitute or a replacement for the U.S.-led efforts to fight ISIS. He says their efforts will be more broad, but it's not clear how the U.S. will coordinate with the Saudi-led group. Brian?
Wyatt, thank you. A new poll could be used to help protect Christians in the Middle East. It shows Americans are aware of ISIS atrocities and agree they should be considered genocide. The designation could prompt the U.S. government to take action. The Marist poll, sponsored by the Knights of Columbus, shows 55% of Americans agree with the term genocide in this case. 59% they say they have heard a great deal or a good amount about terrorists targeting Christians and other religious minorities. The Knights say a coalition of religious leaders, researchers, and scholars sent a letter to Secretary of State John Kerry. They're asking the State Department to include Christians in any determination of genocide. Excitement builds along the Texas-Mexico border as Pope Francis announced he'll visit there in February. Catholic Extension is helping to arrange the papal visit. The organization helps migrants and refugees along the border. The Diocese of El Paso is helping to coordinate a cross-border papal mass. El Paso Bishop Mark Seitz joining us by Skype tonight. Your Excellency, tell us about the plan for the open-air Mass along the border with Pope Francis.
Well, of course, we're very excited to know that Pope Francis is coming to our border region. And I think among the things that the Holy Father wanted to do while he was there was to celebrate a Mass close to the border. He had heard about the fact that we have an annual Mass at the border where we celebrate our unity as members of the Church, even though we're divided in a certain way because we're two countries. So he himself is going to be celebrating a Mass at the border, and we're hoping that we can participate also from our side.
I find it interesting that the Church, by its universal nature, can sort of cancel those international boundaries in a sense. Do you think the Holy Father's Mass and his visit to Juarez and the border region will help spark compassion for the poor in our midst?
Well, that's certainly my hope. When we see it through God's eyes, we see the love that he has for his whole human family. We don't really see borders any more than I do when I look down across our valley and realize that we are two different communities that are still really one large metropolitan area.
What would you like Americans to know about the situation there on the border and how the Church addresses that?
Well, I think the Holy Father chose this region because it's somewhat unique in its ability to show the possibility of people in two different nations having a different kind of feel and a different kind of relationship for each other, especially given the fact that we were originally one city and then it was divided by the decision of our two countries to put a border through the city. We've always lived in a certain way on both sides of the border, and we look at the people on the other side not as potential enemies, but as members of our family, and many of them, frankly, are.
We appreciate you sharing it with us, Bishop Mark Seitz of El Paso. Thanks for joining us tonight.
It's a pleasure, Brian. Thank you very much.
Up next, now that there's a global climate agreement, what happens next? And the little town of Bethlehem, where Jesus was born, holds its first ever Christmas parade. Thanks for joining us for EWTN News Nightly. I'm Brian Patrick, and in supporting the new climate deal, Pope Francis hopes it will help protect the poor, often most affected by pollution.
Una particolare attenzione alle popolazioni più vulnerabili.
The Pope also expressing hope the accord will help unite the international community. It calls for new investments in clean energy to curtail climate change. Lucia Selecchia is a professor of law at the Catholic University of America. You researched environmental issues from the Catholic point of view. How does the climate deal fit with Pope Francis's thoughts in Laudato Si?
In two ways, primarily. First, it spends a lot of attention talking about assistance to poorer nations and poorer people in addressing this issue. And second, it's the first global convention or agreement to involve every single country that's a party to it. And in the past, certain countries were obligated and others were exempt. And here it asks for a contribution of different kinds from everybody. And I think that's that global solidarity.
What's the relationship between climate change and the poor? How are they most affected?
In two ways. First, many people believe that it is those who are poor, who depend on one type of food for their sustenance or make their living out of one type of farming, will be the first to be impacted, or they'll live in low-lying areas unable to adapt perhaps as quickly as those who are wealthier. So that's one concern. The other concern is that many of the solutions that are proposed also cost money and have impacts on the poor. And so both the issue of climate change and proposed solutions have impacts on the poor.
Will this really make a difference, this agreement?
That's the big question. One of the things that often gets lost in discussions about it is that it is a voluntary agreement. Each nation proposed their own national intended goals. And what the success or the failure will turn on is whether or not countries do what they have promised that they would do. Second, whether the technology will develop to allow them to do that. And third, whether or not the political interest in continuing to focus on this issue will remain. And that's for the future to determine.
Lucia Selecchia, thank you for your perspective tonight.
Thank you.
Well, it's a first, a Christmas parade through the streets of Bethlehem, the birthplace of Jesus. The There's Santa, but the parade really focused on the Holy Family's stay in Bethlehem, with some of the floats taking inspiration from Luke's Gospel. They recount Mary and Joseph's journey from Nazareth, the birth of Jesus, the shepherds, and the three wise men. Then, of course, Santa's there, a Christmas tree, and gifts as hundreds lined the streets.
Merry Christmas to you all from Bethlehem, the city of peace.
Organizers say the parade will become an annual event, together with the lighting of a giant Christmas tree outside the Church of the Nativity. Thanks for joining us. Until tomorrow, I'm Brian Patrick for the EWTN News Nightly team. Good night. God bless you.